Welcome to the first Wednesday word. Today, I'm going to start by laying a little groundwork so that will set the show up going forward. As I've said in the past, I originally was inspired to create this because of a paper that I read and after finding it in social media on Telegram about the word you. And when you endeavor to begin to understand the words that we use every day more thoroughly, it's really quite a fascinating journey. That was probably my first step along that path. So I will link the original Who Is You episode that was the inspiration for this, that I think is nearly a year old now, in the description below. I'd also like to link a few other things. There's a really interesting book called Word Magic that I will link an audio reading of in the description, in addition to the original Who Is You. And I'm also going to link an audio reading of the book, The Hidden Messages in Water by Masaru Emoto. All of those books and readings are a foundation for what my word journey and my comprehension level of what's creating a foundation for this series. So I'll elaborate a little bit on that before I jump straight in to defining the word you and why it's plural, ultimately. Who is you and why? So the word magic goes into it's really a deep dive in how the definition of words from a perspective that most of us don't consider. There's a lot of double speak, or what's also commonly called fork tongue, that goes on with the use of words. And part of that you begin to learn a lot more about when you do things like studying law and history, which is what I have endeavored to work on the last going on 2 years. And the longer I study, the more I have to study, because it's a huge subject that will probably fill the rest of my life. However, it's well worth it. And the best use that I was able to find for this platform, as far in social media of creating videos, was to share my learning adventure with words, because it certainly applies to all of us and it's very helpful. Communication is extremely important, and for more than just what most of us would think are the obvious reasons, in my opinion. That brings me to the third resource in a description, the book, The Hidden Messages in Water. And that, many people may have heard of that, but it's fascinating because Masaru Emoto, sorry if I don't say that quite right, was a scientist who did an amazing study simply on how frequency and words, because there's frequency in words, impacted water, and how water forms in snowflakes and other things, like even rice in a glass container with words written on labels outside, on the outside of the container. It's fascinating because it gives us concrete scientific evidence to support the value and intense importance of words and frequency in real life, in the tangible 3D world, just like ripples in a pond. So those resources should give a really great foundation going forward for this show. And with that, I will dive right into the word you. I know I had previously mentioned that I would talk about we as well, but in doing more detailed thought, it occurs to me that we should just start with a deeper explanation of you before I get into we. which will reveal itself at a later time. And also because I'm trying to keep these shows to a short period of time. I've mentioned in the past how, again, I would prefer to try to, instead of using something like a fire hose format, I want to give you a glass of water so you can digest the information easily and go on about your day or your evening, whichever that should happen to be. So the word you is actually, in its oldest sense and how it originally developed, was a plural. And in fact, I'll share my screen and show you that here just a moment. I just used Bard, and I want to clarify, I don't think that's the best resource. As this show continues to develop, I will get into using other dictionaries, and we'll go over the value of different dictionaries. But for now, I wanted to keep it simple, and Bard did pull up a nice resource on the etymology of you. So if you're not familiar, Bard is Google's AI engine. So I have not in the past been super comfortable with AI, but I have learned to use it as a research tool and found it to be extremely valuable. So I just had to stop being stubborn and try it. So that's a whole nother conversation. We'll leave AI alone for today. Suffice to say, it is very useful, and I think there's a lot of positive things we can do with it, despite the converse. So you'll see here, the etymology of you is fascinating and reveals its surprising journey through time. And immediately we jump forward to the Proto-Indo-European or Old English, which clearly shows us even 5,000 years ago, the root form of the word you was plural. And this talks about how it evolved. It's pretty interesting. You see as you go along here that it did eventually evolve into a use for both singular and plural. It would appear that if Bard is correct, remember we always have to double check our research when we're using AI. If Bard is correct, that it originally started being utilized in both forms as a singular and plural in France, in the French language. So I think that's pretty interesting. But for now, that's the deepest we're going to go as far as referencing dictionaries or, what have you. But we'll leave that there. So how could you be a plural? I think that was actually pretty interesting to me when I first read that paper nearly a year ago and discovered that I had not ever purposely used it that way to my knowledge at that time. And since then, I have done a great deal of study to learn more about law and legal matters, the difference between commerce and common law. And that's where you becomes even more interesting. So in commerce, we are persons, not people. A person is an entity, not a living man or woman. Suffice it to say, I will likely dive into those definitions at a later date, but it's pretty simple to look those up. I would suggest utilizing a dictionary like Black's Law or Bouvier's. When you're using something like Wikipedia, you could try Bard, of course, or an AI engine. It would likely give you a broader perspective. But I would highly encourage using more than one resource to define those words to give you a broad perspective and comprehension. But that is the case typically when the word person is used in a commercial situation, as in most courts that most people think of. They think of commercial courts. That is a statutory system. And a person is an entity, which is not the same as a living man or woman. So a people is a living man or woman in reference to, say, common law, and a person is an entity not living in reference to commerce. Now, commerce is public and common law is private. So those are two really big distinctions. It would seem to me that the lines have become more and more blurry in our modern world between the public and the private. And I think that's really apparent. I'm not going to try to clarify that with examples. Well, I guess I will. I take that back. For example, a private conversation, one behind closed doors between a mother and a father or two friends, they may say things that they don't want to share in a public environment, things that are private about the family or private about internal affairs between them only, right? I mean, it seems obvious, but I'm giving this because it does seem like many things, the lines have been blurred in our modern society. Public, of course, would be this. This is public. I'm going to broadcast this right on YouTube and Rumble. So I'm not trying to hide anything. It's not even necessarily hiding, actually, because there is a protocol should private information need to be utilized to establish someone's intentions. There is a protocol where private information could be disclosed even in a court in an equity court situation, not a public court situation, which is, again, remember, public is commercial or commerce, statutory. So there's some very specific distinctions that make something public versus private. So when your person appears in a commercial statutory court, which is, again, what we think of as most courts generally, most people think all courts are commercial courts. Not always true, but that's the general assumption. And it's where you usually end up, because generally it's for your person who is conducting public affairs out in commerce. So like your Lyft driver or the waitress at the restaurant, or often when you go to work, say, I used to be in the mortgage business, I was in commerce. So when you go to court, your person appears in court. And of course, we have to realize an entity that is not alive cannot function without being animated by a living being, right? So when the person appears in a commercial court, there are two things there making it possible for the person to appear. The living being is animating the person to bring it to the commercial court. So you is the proper plural use in that case in a commercial court. However, it is possible that the living man or woman or being could also attend an equity court or a common law court as the living being, and then would only be that one living being. We're going to keep it simple with public and private right now. So this can be a little more complicated than that, suffice to say, for now. So that's really the simplest explanation of you and why it is always a plural, or not always, how it can be a plural. But the other reason, it's not just because of public and private. There is a requirement within the legal codes and the lawful system in common law and in commercial law, whereas like can only contract with like. So it's actually very necessary for one to have a person if they wish to function in commerce, in the commercial system, in business. And the reason is because technically a living man or woman, being a people, cannot contract with a corporation, entity, or person. I know that sounds strange, but again, if you start doing some research on this, you'll find it to be true. Only like can contract with like. So that means only another entity, business, person, corporation, what have you, can contract with the same business, corporation, or person. And only a living being can contract with a living being. They can't intermix. A living being cannot contract with a corporation or a person. That's just how the law works. Again, something else that I will save for a deeper explanation in the future with respect to attempting to keep these videos short. So that makes it clear why it's really necessary for one to have their own person should they wish to operate in commerce in the commercial system with a job, or even if they're self-employed, if you wish to exchange services in commerce, then you need to have a person because it requires contracts in order to do that. If you get into trusts, even spoken trusts are contract agreements. Mind you, you can do that in private, but in private, it would be with a living being, and that living, you would contract with another living being. You wouldn't in commerce, because in commerce does not see living beings. Commerce only sees persons. I realize there's a lot of questions that may be coming up, but hopefully this will encourage people to start doing some research because it really is fascinating. It's easy to dismiss, but one of the things that I have found that we don't realize is when we dismiss these simple things, we overlook other things that actually do us harm in a day-to-day basis. And that's one of the reasons that we see so much controversy in commerce. People often think their living self is the same as their person. And quite literally, they are two different things. And that's why you is plural and who you is. I hope that's been helpful. There was one other thing I wanted to say that occurred to me the other day before I sign off, and that was I've realized in observing what frequency is and really absorbing what frequency is, that all of us have our own frequency. And in addition to that, if you check out the Masaru Emoto evidence supporting how frequency has such an impact in the physical realm, you'll find that this is very important. Our individual frequency is much like a fingerprint. No one else has the same frequency, sort of like an aura, I would imagine. So each word also has its own frequency when spoken. When you combine your own frequency and intention behind the word with the word itself, this is a unique occurrence in infinity, really. Each time we speak a word, it is a unique occurrence in infinity. That's kind of cool sounding. Anyway, so that taken into account, to me, it certainly seems that the use of words between prayer and spelling are two sides of the same coin. I thought that was a really neat concept, so I wanted to share. And with that, I will say au revoir. See you next time.